Psalm 42. As a deer longs for flowing streams, so my soul longs for you, O God. My soul thirsts for God, for the living God. When shall I come and behold the face of God? My tears have been my food day and night, while people say to me continually, "Where is your God?" These things I remember as I pour out my soul, how I went to the throng and led them in procession to the house of God, with glad shouts and songs of thanksgiving, a multitude keeping festival.
Thank you to the choir and to God's Light. They led in the 8:45 service as well and have done double duty, and so thank you to them, and I know your gratitude extends to them as well. If you don't have your Love Makes the World Go Round tickets yet, I think there's still some available. There are, so please make sure you get your tickets if you don't have those. And of course, we hope to see you at the Administrative Council this week, and if it passes at Administrative Council at Charge Conference as well. I love this text. I was walking in and one of the gentlemen in the church said this is one of his favorite texts. I love it. I love this text. I love the question that's in the middle of it, where is your God? It's been saying, and the question's being asked in a tough manner, in a tough way. It's being asked in a way that's in a difficult environment, in a difficult situation. My tears have been my food day and night. People say to me all day long, people mock me all day long, really, is what the psalmist is saying. Where is your God? Where is your God? Have you asked that before? Have you asked it recently? Have you asked it this morning? Where is God? Where is your God? It's a question that gets asked often nowadays, and in a culture that continues to think less and less of God and even less of God's people. It's an important question. Where is your God? Where is God? On this morning, as we focus on this third Sunday of this series about our vows, we're going to talk about where is God and how to see God and experience God and where we can go and meet with God. I mean, that's why you're here, right? That's why you're here, because you want to experience God. That's why I'm here. That's why we're all here. We're looking to experience and meet God. And so we come here to do that. So let me give you a tool, and there'll be a couple in this sermon, on how you can answer the question, where is God? Where is your God? One of the ways that we can do that is to say, what is the will of God? And if we're discussing and answering the question, what is the will of God, it walks us into a place, it walks us into the ability that if we can say we know the will of God, then we know where God is. And what is the will of God? It is always the same thing. What is the most loving thing to do? What does love require? What does love require is always the answer to what is the will of God. What does love require? So let's start there. I remember being 18 years old, a long, long time ago. Some of it's longer for you than me. But 18, I was in my first couple weeks of college. I was playing at a small Methodist college down in LaGrange, playing baseball and basketball, and one of the stipulations of them letting you do both is you had to go to 6:30 study hall. That's not Christian. 6:30 in the morning study hall for an 18-year-old kid. There was nothing endearing or good about it at all. And one night, pretty early in the semester, I stayed up late playing Super Nintendo, Super Tecmo Bowl, 18 years ago. I'm dating myself, 18 years old. And I overslept the beginning of study hall. I overslept. You know what your biggest fear is and you have nightmares about is being late for study hall or being late for practice. I walked in 20 minutes late. And you know what they said to me when I walked in 20 minutes late? Not a word. The coaches, the assistant coach who was there that day, the trainers whose job it was to take roll, didn't say a word to me. The upperclassmen, the older players, did not say a word to me. I just walked in, sat down, pretended to study, and then went to breakfast. Got to breakfast and saw coaches and players. Nobody said a word about it. Hey, how you doing? Good to see you. Went to class. Not a word. Past the coaches, past the trainers, past everybody in the hallway on the quad. Nobody said a word. And then I got to practice. And the coach said, this was basketball, the words that every basketball player hates to hear. Y'all go to the baseline because you're about to run and run and run. And as I began to move to the baseline, coach said, not you, Porter, you come over here with me. He said, Porter was late for study hall this morning. That might as well mean you didn't even go, Porter. And when someone's not here, if you're not present, if you're not here, you can't win. If you don't show up, Porter, you can't win. If you don't show up, then you can't win. And if one of us doesn't show up, if one of us isn't present, then we can't win together. Show up. And then he put all of them on the baseline and ran them while I lay down and watched, because he made me lay down on a pillow that was probably 25 years old and had never been washed for freshmen who were late for study hall. And they ran and they ran and they ran. And I laid there on that smelly pillow and watched. It's a great life lesson 30 years later. You have to show up. When you don't show up, you lose. When we don't show up, we lose. And when we don't show up, others lose. Now, can I quit talking about something as silly as a basketball practice? I was 18, so 15 years ago. Just making sure you're still with me. When we don't show up, when we aren't present, we lose. When we don't show up, those around us miss us, and they lose. When we aren't present, we miss out on God's blessing. I was reading a Harvard study a few weeks ago. I don't know how they do this, but I trust it. It says 47% of the time, our minds are in a different place than our feet. I'll say it again. 47% of the time, our minds are in a different place than our feet. If you're like me, you thought, only 47? Let me see if this sounds like you. Sometimes at work you have a hard time focusing because you're thinking about other things. I remember during the summer and into the fall, I kept thinking about that trip for the Walk of Paul, and it was hard to focus some days about that cruise, about that trip, about that journey. And you know what happened when I got on that cruise, when I got on that boat, when all that? I focused on work. It's crazy. I thought about work. I thought about you. I thought about other stuff. Spent all that time dreaming and picturing. And if you're honest with me this morning, you do the same stuff. And part of the struggle of our day is that we're being trained to have our brains where our feet are not at. And it's by these things that we carry, the technology we carry. Because at least once this morning, before you've been in this room, many of us, you've already checked your phone to see what's happening somewhere else or what someone else has said. At supper at night or during the day or at work, we have these things that we look at that take us completely somewhere else, and we get distracted. 2 weeks ago, we talked about big dreams. Last week, we talked about having more than an assumed familiarity with the Bible. Today, we're going to talk about the vow of presence, of worship. And here's what happens. Our mind wanders. I did it again at 11. I love that joy hymn. I love that song. It is one of my favorites. I've listened to it all week long. I have it downloaded. I listen to it. I love it. It centers me. And I have been looking forward to hearing the choir sing it. And at 8:45 and again at 11, while they're singing, I got distracted and started thinking about other things. How does that happen when you know it's coming and you love it, and yet still something pulls us away, pulls us out? Do you ever get distracted? Now, I'm not talking about disrupted. Let's be clear here. There's a difference between distractions and disruptions. My brother is going through cancer right now, and it's rough. And basically, he is just in the hospital or he's at home right now. The doctor's office or at home right now. That's a disruption. Where the disruption means everything he's got to do, he's got to focus on handling that. You've got similar situations in your life. You've got times in your life where things get, COVID was a disruption, where disruptions come and it takes everything you have to overcome it. That's not what I'm talking about when I talk about distractions. Distractions are optional. We either embrace a distraction or learn to resist distraction. We miss God's will because we allow worldly influences to pull us away from God. In order to understand and comprehend God's will, we must be fully present. We must show up. We miss an unbelievable amount of God's blessings because we are distracted and they go right over our heads or right under our noses. And we're either focused on tomorrow's blessings, we're focused on this great thing that's going to happen down the road. There's this, I'm going to get this promotion. I know I'm going to get it one day. Once we get to the point where we can buy this house, once we get to this point where we're going to have this, when this happens, we're going to have this blessing and it's going to be great. And we spend all this time here and in the now wishing and looking forward to. Meanwhile, God is saying, I've got blessings I want to pour into you right now. I've got teachings and I've got love and I've got a will for you that's right here, right now. You hear people ask you the questions, where am I at? God says, I'm right here. And when you show up and you put your feet on the ground and when your heart is where your feet are, I can pour into you and I can love you when you're present. And worship becomes this thing that just transforms and changes us. But that's not the one that really gets us. The one that gets us is when we are focused on the blessings of the past. And we can only hear about and think about the way that it used to be and the way that it was. And we look back and we go, it was phenomenal, it was incredible, but it'll never be that good again, so we'll just suck it up and get through it. And God is saying, yes, that was great, and I did that, and I loved you. But if you'll look at me, if you'll put your feet on the ground, if you'll listen to me, if you'll let me pour into you, I've got more now than you can even imagine. But be present. Be present. It's never been easier than today, than now, than to be distracted. It has never been so easy to focus on completely unimportant matters as it is now. Speaking of, let's get to Twitter. A preacher friend of mine we were at a gathering, and we were sitting and we were talking, and he said, let me tell you what my wife did. Now, she's about 5'2", about 105 pounds, soaking wet. To give you a picture, 3 small children. They were at supper, and he's got his phone out, and he's the senior pastor of a very large church. It's a very important job. I can't even get it out. It's a very important job, you know what I'm saying? And so there's times you read your text or you read your emails, because this is an important job. So he's sitting at the table and he said, in my own mind, in my own soul, this is an important job. And so I need to have my phone, even though my kids are here and my wife's here. This is an important thing. And his wife looked at him and said, honey, what are you doing? And he went, oh no, I'm busted. He said, I was so tempted to lie to her. I so wanted to lie to her right now. He said, but I had to tell her in front of my kids, I was tweeting about the movie Moonfall. And you know what she did? 5'2", 105 pounds. She stood up, walked out in the front yard, and started hollering to the neighborhood about a movie that she had just watched. Walked back in and sat down. This is what the story told us. Went in, sat down, and started eating again like nothing had happened. And he looked at her and said, have you lost your mind? Are you crazy? She said, what's different than what I've done than what you just did? You make the whole world think you're crazy by doing all this stuff. I just make the neighborhood crazy. And then she said, well, not the whole world, just those 20 people who follow you, which was the hardest cut of all for him. It's never been easier to be distracted. Now, 2 weeks ago, and one of the comments from these sermons that I've gotten the most comments on was you really loving the idea of pouring into future generations and impacting these families and impacting these kids and loving these kids. So as uncomfortable as this part's going to be, I can't leave it out. That same Harvard review talked about how difficult it is for working families and both parents working, and what families have to do to be able to pour back into their kids, what families have to do to be able to engage and to love and to not be distracted. They said, but in that study, it also said, but that pales in comparison to the danger for families that are together and mom and dad are distracted by their technology. Where mom and dad are together, and whenever they're together, one's on their phone, or one's on the iPad, or one's on this, or one's on that. The danger and the damage that's done to kids because they're being taught they're not as important as what's happening there, even when they're together. It's never been easier to be distracted as it is right now. And that study talked about the bonds that are broken in our distraction. As a church, we understand the bonds that are broken in distraction, do we not? Part of the beauty of Jesus is he would not get distracted. He would not be distracted. Jesus is in ministry, Jesus is working, and there are people everywhere. There are disciples everywhere around him. People are coming in all directions, and this is important ministry. This is important mission. This is big stuff. And then there are these little people that are on the sides, and they've got peanut butter and jelly on their face, and they've got snot coming down their face, these kids. And the disciples are saying, get these people, get these children out of here. We cannot be distracted by these children. And do you remember what Jesus said? That's not a distraction. That's the kingdom of God. Bring those children to me. Bring those children to me. The Son of God, Jesus, the lily of the valley, the bright and morning star, was never too busy for children. How can we possibly be? But let me go a little deeper. Jesus is hanging on a cross. You remember? He's hanging on a cross. He's moments away from the angelic chorus and being in the throne room of God with his Creator, our Creator, the Father, the God, the love. He's literally choking, drowning in his own blood. And there's a criminal on each side. Criminals on each side. If there was ever a time a man could have said, you know what, I got enough on my plate, I don't need any of this. If there was ever a time where a man could have said, you know what, I got enough going on, y'all are on your own. But what love required in that moment, what was the will of God in that moment, was for Jesus to take time even out of his dying and death and say, I see you. And if you will give your life to me, if you will walk away from the distractions of sin and evil, you can be with me. Jesus showed us continually, it is why we love him so much, what love requires, how to not be distracted by the noise. God's love requires that we welcome and we love. Do you know Nehemiah in the Old Testament, about the 15th chapter, about the 15th book of the Old Testament, roughly? I love Nehemiah. Nehemiah doesn't get enough credit. Nehemiah wasn't a prophet. He wasn't a king. He wasn't a warrior. He wasn't a priest. He was just a dude, just a guy. As a matter of fact, his job was really like a valet. He was like a servant of King Artaxerxes. And he's at work one day back home, and his brother comes to him and he says, have you heard what's happening in Jerusalem? Nehemiah, have you heard what's going on in Jerusalem? It is a mess. And Nehemiah had heard, and in that moment, Nehemiah was able to align with his goals, was able to align with what he viewed for his life and what broke God's heart. Nehemiah was in that moment able to align with what he was going to do with his life with God's will and what love required. And in that moment, he was fully able to be present with God and what God wanted for him. And so let me give you a quick refresher. 587 BC, King Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians destroy Judah. They destroy Solomon's temple. The wall is leveled. The wall is 7 to 8 feet thick, 90 feet high, gone, destroyed, burnt, gone. And Nehemiah hears a word from God and says, let's go do it. Let's go rebuild it. We can do that. Now, the beginning of Nehemiah, it's kind of a rough. They do not get off to a great start. They probably tried to do a podcast about Moses or something. Wasted a lot of time. They do not get off to a great start. They're struggling. And then about chapter 6, and we're going to throw the scripture up here for you. About chapter 6, you see that it's going well. In verse 1, it says, "Now when it was reported to Sanballat and Tobiah and to Geshem the Arab and to the rest of our enemies that I had built the wall and there was no gap left in it except for the doors and the gates." So the wall is up 90 feet, 5 to 6 feet thick. The wall is up. The momentum is strong. It is moving. It is happening. It is going. And what happens? Distraction. Distraction. And let me say this to you, brothers and sisters. Every time, I wish I could say to you, when you get aligned with the will of God, when you get aligned with what does love require, everything's going to be great. But it is never great in that moment because the enemy shows up. And the distractions from the enemy will always, always, always be able to try to pull you away from what God is calling you to do. And what will keep you from being present in the place and in the space of God is the distraction of the enemy who will always be trying to keep you from doing the will of God. And I know you. You are doing great things. Not just at Smyrna First, but I know the ministry that you do, the bicycles that you buy, the kids that you feed, the life that you bring into this community. Let me say to you that as you are doing that ministry, don't let distractions come in and grab you. Sanballat and Geshem sent to me saying, "Come and let us meet together in one of the villages in the plain of Ono." But they intended to do me harm, Nehemiah said. Nehemiah understands, this average, ordinary man of God understands that when you are making things happen for God with God's blessings, distractions and critics are going to come fight you. They surface everywhere. Nehemiah had to be thinking, this could be an opportunity. I could gain favor with these folks. I could build relationships with these folks. I could win these over with these people with my passion. I'll leave the work. I'll just let it sit here for a little bit, and I'll go and have this discussion. I could change my critics' minds, Nehemiah has to be thinking. But what he understood is this. What he could have mistaken for opportunity was nothing more than a distraction. And Nehemiah would not be deceived. And he offers this great gift that is available to you and to me today that none of us do well. Are you ready for it? This great gift? Nehemiah uses this word that is powerful. Most of you can't say it. No. No. Do it with me. Let's do it together. No. Because see, here's what happens. People come into your life while you're trying to do the work, while you're trying to learn the will of God, while you're trying to do Bible study, while you're trying to focus, and people will come in and ask you to do the craziest thing. And if you get a no out, you know what you do next? What we do next? You give an excuse. Brothers and sisters, if you don't hear anything else in this sermon, hear this. No is a complete sentence. No is a complete sentence. If what you are doing is the will of God, if what you are doing is pleasing to God, if what you are doing is what love requires, no is more than sufficient. And Nehemiah says, no. In verse 3, I sent messengers to them saying, I'm doing a great work and I cannot come. Why should the work stop while I leave it to come down to you? Brothers and sisters, you are doing a great work. You're doing a great work. Don't get distracted. We say no not because we don't care. We say no because we don't want to be distracted from what love requires. 4 times it says they sent it to me. 4 times they came to me. And 4 times Nehemiah says he answered in the same way. And finally the 5th time, are you ready? Let's have some church. And so finally for the 5th time, the 5th time word comes to him, and this is what they say to him. It's an open letter. They put it in a letter. They put it in writing. And the 5th time, this is what they say to him. We're hearing in the nations are hearing that you're trying to become king, that you're trying to call prophets, that you're trying to make all these things happen, that you're trying to do it for your own power. That the nations are saying, and in our church world, I'm fixing to preach. In our church world now, in our world, do you know how we word that? People are saying. People are saying. People are saying are some of the meanest, nastiest folks you have ever heard and never met in your life. And you can't get distracted. You can't get distracted. Nehemiah hears it and he knows it. And he knows what they're doing. He knows what they're saying. And he knows not one bit of it's true. And so he says this. He says, it's not true. I'm going to dig in harder and I'm going to work harder. And in verse 15, it says this, that they finished it. On the 52nd day, they finished it. They got the work done. They got the miracle done. They got the ministry done because they would not be distracted. Brothers and sisters, if you know you are doing the will of God, if you know you are doing what love requires, don't get distracted. Focus and drill deep and drill down and let God bless you and continue to pour into you and pour onto you and pour through you to others. And show up. Be present. Let the Holy Spirit pour into you and lead you and guide you and hold you and keep doing what God is calling you to do. I want to close with this. Carolyn, if you'll go ahead. I was 25 years old. I haven't told this story here. I think some of the leadership's probably heard it. I was 25. I made sure I worked on Sundays when I worked for Longhorn because I did not want to be a preacher at all. I'm the son and grandson of Methodist preachers. I did not want this. So I would make sure I worked on Sundays so I couldn't go to church. And I'm down in Statesboro, Georgia. General manager's been fired. I'm running the front and the back of the house, 25 years old, which basically means I'm around a bunch of college students at Georgia Southern. It's a pretty good gig, except for this night. There's a young lady, her name was Shay. She's waiting tables that night. Except for she kept going back into this is before cell phones. There was a time we did not have cell phones, reverends. The rich people had them. Joey would have had one. And she kept going back to the kitchen and getting on the phone. And I'm waiting her tables. So I'm running the kitchen, I'm waiting her tables, I'm running the front of the house. I mean, I'm doing everything. And so I grabbed her and I said, Shay, if I catch you on the phone one more time, I'm going to have to fire you. You're ignoring your tables. I'm 25 years old. You're ignoring, I'm going to have to fire you if I find you on the phone one more time. And she doesn't say anything. She just kind of moves off. 5 minutes later, I'm doing the tour, I'm doing the spin, I'm doing the cycle, I'm running around, I'm hitting here, I'm hitting there, I'm hitting here. I walk through the kitchen, and guess who's on the phone? Shay. I said, Shay, do you want me to fire you? And she turns to me, and her face is just horrified. At home, she's got a 6-year-old and a 4-year-old, and the 6-year-old's watching the 4-year-old because her husband's left her, and she's afraid to tell anybody because this is the only job and it's the only income. And so she's calling the house every 10 minutes to make sure that the kids are okay. And I'm just looking at her going, how did you miss this? How did you get so caught up? How did you get so busy? How did you get? And so that night I sat on the dumpster pad at Statesboro, Georgia, Longhorn, and I said, all right, I'm going to be present from now on. I'm going home, God. It's time for me to answer the call. There are moments where God just grabs you and you realize how lost you are and how broken you are and how big a mess you are. Don't make yourself have to end up on a dumpster pad, horrified at the brokenness of your own soul, missing what's needed in front of you. Show up. Be present. Dig in. And don't get distracted. Amen? Amen.